Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Brooklands Museum. Tonight we have over 200 people here and more than 50 online to welcome Dr. Kate Vigurs. Now, over the years, we've had so many stories and great tales of courage and fortitude in this very room, but few can match the frighteningly heroic stories of the members of F Section SOE during the Second World War. I'm therefore delighted to introduce you to Kate, a professional freelance historian who's an acknowledged expert on the lives of women in the SOE and who frequently appears on TV and radio. She's a weapons expert on time commanders. Oh, and by the way, there's a fascinating short film on her website on how to make a bomb out of a dead rat. But please, guys, don't try this at home. Or if you do, get your mum's permission. Anyway, she's also a tour guide, covering the Western Front battlefields, Berlin and Krakow, Auschwitz, and has done consultancy work for a number of museums. She also has her own historical interpretation company, History's Made, which regularly produces scripts and films and other media ventures. So as a general expert and good egg, may I please welcome Dr. Kate Vigurs.
So a very good evening to you. A huge thanks to Brooklands Museum for such amazing hospitality so far, and to all of you for coming out on a rather hot evening. I do hope that I can keep you entertained for the next 45 minutes or so, although of course there are some somewhat harrowing tales in here as well. So it's wonderful to be in such a historic place, but I really want to bring to life for you tonight the history of the Women of Special Operations Executive. So during the Second World War, 39 women were selected to work in a secretive, clandestine, and mainly male domain, the Special Operations Executive French section. Well, that's a bit of a mouthful, so I'm going to be calling it SOE F section from here on in. Ranging from housewives and mothers to shop assistants and countesses, these women were put through a rigorous training program in which they learnt things like silent killing, instinctive shooting, and sabotage, as well as survival tactics to prepare them for life as a secret agent. Some went by parachute, others landed by boat or aircraft to begin their dangerous work in enemy-occupied France, where for most of them work would involve being a wireless operator or a courier. The latter often travelled hundreds of kilometres carrying vital yet incriminating information, whilst the former assisted in receiving arms and vital supplies, undertaking huge risks to make contact with SOE headquarters over the radio waves. Behind enemy lines, these men and women operated, well, the women specifically, I should say, operated beyond the protection of the Geneva Convention. And at worst, they were given a life expectancy of 6 weeks and a survival rate of 50-50. Now, the Nazi occupation of Europe and the resistance rising up against it showed the War Cabinet they needed to use agents to fight from within. The fall of France in June 1940 came as a huge blow to the Allies, and it led to the forming of Special Operations Executive. The idea for this new organisation had been mooted in several memoranda throughout the spring and early summer of 1940, and on the 22nd of July, it was formally approved by the War Cabinet. The Prime Minister, by now Winston Churchill, promptly gave the new head of SOE the much-quoted directive to set Europe ablaze. Now, several people have already asked how long it took to write the book, to which I always reply too long, and that's probably because I spent forever in the archives looking for the document which says set Europe ablaze. I can tell you there isn't one. It's in Hugh Dalton's diary, but isn't it a lovely thing, and I think we'll stick with it. Now, the objective with SOE was to coordinate and assist local clandestine activity against the Axis powers and their occupying forces in territories across Europe and beyond. SOE agents would liaise with, equip, train and arm the local resistance so that when the time came, they could pave the way for the invading forces of D-Day and finally fight back against the occupiers. SOE agents would assist in sabotage and subversion on every single level. This could range from smaller acts of resistance, such as false intelligence or false propaganda, to cutting power lines, right the way through to derailing trains and blowing up factories and pretty much everything in between. And they did all of this in spite of the Nazi threat that any active or passive resistance to the German armed forces would incur the most severe of retaliatory measures. Now, tonight I'm talking about F section, but I don't want you going away thinking that it was only in France that all of this happened. SOE actually set up a vast number of sections, and they worked in various countries, including, but not restricted to, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Yugoslavia, Greece, Italy, and Albania. They even operated as far as the Far East in Force 136. I think we can all agree that the French do like to complicate things, and their history is somewhat convoluted. So they didn't just have F section, they actually had 6 sections working within their country. But luckily for you, I'm just going to focus on one of them, which is F section. And then SOE divided France up. So at the beginning of the war, when the Nazis first occupied, they only occupied the top zone, cunningly called the occupied zone. There was then a demarcation line, and then we have the unoccupied zone. But SOE took it one step further, and to start off with, they were primarily working in the occupied zone. So they divided France up like a patchwork quilt, as you can see here. So various sections or networks, and they've all got remarkably silly names. So let's find some. We've got stationer, wrestler, salesman, footman, prunus. So they all have names. You're lucky I'm not talking about Belgium because they were all named after vegetables, which I'm looking forward to starting that one. So this is what France looked like. Now, if I may jump forwards, in April 1942, 2 years after its creation, and in accordance with its central tenet to go straight for the objective across any social or military conventions that might get in the way, SOE made the groundbreaking decision to employ women in the field as secret agents. Frankly, I'm glad you're all sitting down at this moment, because telling them in 1942 that women could do the same as men did come as a bit of a shock to some. So hopefully you're all safe there. It was an unprecedented move. Up until this point, women's war work had been vast, and it had covered a wide variety of things, from working in munitions or aircraft factories, drivers, clerical work, nursing. They worked in the auxiliary services, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Some of them even worked abroad, but only a very few had recently engaged in combat behind enemy lines. And indeed, it was the usefulness of women agents and the value that they provided that had just been proved to the organization through the exploits of 2 women. Firstly, Christina Skarbek. She was Polish, also known as Christine Granville, and Virginia Hall, an American. And I'll focus on her for a little while. I noticed that the stunning painting of her as a wireless operator in the field was used as the image for this talk, so we need to know more about Virginia. She was an American national and was in Paris when the Battle of France took place, and she volunteered in the ambulance services, working under enemy bombardment with a friend with whom she had volunteered at the outbreak of war. She worked transporting the wounded to safety. When the capital was occupied, she left France via Spain, where she met British secret agent George Bellows in August of 1940. Inspired by her courage, powers of observation, and most of all, her unqualified desire to help the French fight back, he gave her a number to call when she reached London. It was a number of F Section's Nicholas Boddington. They arranged to meet at his house in Mayfair, near where he was staying, on the 14th of January 1941. And it was a meeting that would change her life. And in fact, her life had changed even before all of this. She'd been working for the American Diplomatic Service, and she had been serving in Izmir in Turkey. When not on duty, she rather enjoyed being part of a hunting party. And one day, whilst out hunting, she climbed over a gate with a shotgun over her arm and tripped. She pulled the trigger of the shotgun, releasing it into her own leg, nearly blowing it off. She was rushed off to hospital, where she nearly died of gangrene. Amazingly, she survived, but her leg was amputated, and it was replaced with a wooden false leg, and she had to get used to it, and one way to do that was to give it a nickname, and it became known as Cuthbert. Now, Virginia arrived after much delay in the picturesque town of Vichy, some 400 kilometers from Paris, on the 23rd of August, 1941. She was wearing 2 money belts strapped around her waist, stuffed full of French francs, with which she could build a resistance network, financial bribes, and fund her own living expenses. Her cover was as a journalist for the New York Post, and her insightful articles painted a vivid picture of French life under occupation, from food shortages to deportations. Vichy was the capital of the unoccupied zone at this point, so her American neutrality really helped her out. And in fact, it became known as the Vichy regime under the leadership of Marshal Pétain, the 84-year-old hero from the First World War, who was basically the puppet leader in the unoccupied zone. Now, for Virginia, with the backing of locals and the knowledge that she could, as far as possible, trust them, she was unable to undertake her role as organizer of something called the Heckler Circuit. She provided intelligence reports about the conditions in France, as well as developing her various contacts with a view to building up the resistance. She worked tirelessly and effectively. Her SOE file praises her high degree of organizing ability and a clear-sighted appreciation of F-Section's needs. She acted as a go-between, carrying instructions to F-Section personnel and generally taking care of them, seeing to their everyday requirements. She met practically every F-Section agent sent to France during this period and helped them in any way possible. She provided papers and cover stories. She looked after them when they were in difficulty, and she did everything she could to get them organized. Most agents came to know Virginia as an affable and approachable person who took to her role with skill and efficiency, which instilled in them a sense of confidence and calm. She was there when anyone needed her and could help with practically any eventuality, from low morale to getting a desperate person out of danger and across an escape line. Her home was welcoming and it was friendly, and I imagine that's just what you need when you've dangled off the end of a parachute into occupied France. F-Section agent Ben Calburn said, if you sit in her kitchen long enough, you will see most people pass through with one sort of problem or another, which she deals with promptly. She was admired and she was trusted. Now, I can't tell her whole story for you tonight. Hopefully this will encourage you to go and find out more about her. I wonder where you could do that. So it was while she was still active in the field that the groundbreaking decision was made by SOE F-Section to use women as agents. She'd proved they could do it, as had Christina Skarbek. And the ad hoc fashion in which these 2 women had been recruited and prepared for their various roles was now formalized through an interview process and a training program. Virginia lasted a few more weeks in the field, during which time she managed to break out 12 agents from prison, and then she became brûlée, which means blown. She had to escape across the Pyrenees. She wore espadrilles and a tweed suit, and when she eventually made it to Spain, she sent a wireless message saying that she had made it safely, but Cuthbert was giving her some bother. Some hapless fellow on the other end of the wireless line replied, if Cuthbert bothers you, have him eliminated. Funnily enough, she left SOE and went to join the Office of Strategic Services, becoming the first female member of CIA. Anyway, that's a little brief insight into the wonderful Virginia. Now, what do you do if you want to recruit female secret agents to work for a secret organization? Well, the answer is you don't put an advert in the Times, secret agents wanted, apply within. It wasn't like the Bletchley crossword. And it was this man, Selwyn Jepson, SOE's recruiting officer, who worked hard to ensure that the right women were brought on board. He believed that women would be sensible, in his view. Women, he said, were very much better than men for this kind of work. Women, as you must know, have a greater capacity for cool and lonely courage than men, because men don't work alone. Their lives tend to always be in company with other men. Well, you're not going to argue with him, are you? Now, on a more practical level, and this is really why F section started to employ women, was because they were less likely to attract attention when they went about their day-to-day duties in France, like cycling, which was important for courier work. They could use covers like district nurses or medical or cosmetic representatives and teachers. Whereas by the summer of 1942, men of working age, men of military age between 18 and 50, who would have been in the French army had it still existed, were rounded up into a forced labor program, the Service du Travail Obligatoire. Basically, they were sent to forced labor camps to work for the German war effort. These were not concentration camps, but you also had no choice. So if you evaded this kind of work, you had to run for it. And this is where the maquis were formed, the sort of feral resistance, if you will, who lived in the scrublands and the hills. But women, although they were recorded in the census, were never dragged into the STO. And so they were in a more advantageous position to carry out clandestine activities undercover. And the paths the women took to SOE were as diverse as they were themselves. In its formative months in 1940, SOE had very much relied on the old boys network. Word-of-mouth recruitment was encouraged. Male friends would seek each other out. You know, universities, colleges, schools, rugby clubs, they would all try and find each other and work together. But there was no female equivalent in 1942. In fact, I'd argue there still isn't. And neither was there any prescribed method of recruiting female agents, partly as a result of which SOE recruited an extraordinary range of women, from the ranks of aristocracy to those of the working classes, and of all ages. Sonia Butt was the youngest. She was 19 years old when she went into occupied territory. And the eldest, Marie-Thérèse Lechaine, was 51. Now, there was no particular experience of war work required, although I will say I did look at a file for a lady called Joyce Hannafay, and the reason they turned her down was she hadn't done any previous war work. So they did flit about in the way that they wanted people to be. I think the most apposite women were women who had already been in France, either at the outset or in the early years of the war, and they had some experience of what it was like living in France under Nazi rule. Perhaps they even worked for the resistance. 4 of the female agents recruited into F section, André Borel, Vera Lee, Madeleine Damamont, and Nancy Wake, had previously worked on escape lines. The best example I can give you of this is just think hello, hello, and those dreadful downed airmen. That's basically what it was, getting downed airmen, prisoners of war, people who were in danger, out across these networks of lines, usually up into the Pyrenees, dropping down into Spain, and if you weren't caught, going across to Gibraltar and through to the United Kingdom. It was a perilous, perilous thing to do, either to be the one crossing it or the one organising it. But these women possess an excellent knowledge of France, an understanding of life under occupation, excellent language skills because they were native, and so they were a very strong asset to SOE. Now, several of the women, quite remarkably, were mothers or housewives, and they found themselves called to interview through various ruses. Marguerite Peggy Knight was overheard speaking French at a party. It's even more bizarre than that. She was drinking champagne and dropped a book. When she picked it up, she realized it was in French, and for whatever reason, it must have been a really dull party, she started to read it out loud. Somebody noticed she was speaking French, and you can imagine the rest. Yvonne Roudelard was approached through contacts at the Ebury Court Club. This is a massive spy club in London, but it was such a good spy club, nobody knew it was a spy club. Lise de Bézac, Eliane Pluman, Francine Agazarian already had spouses or siblings in SOE who put them forward as viable candidates to be considered by the organisation. Now, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force was also instructed to look out for exceptional women who might be useful to SOE. And they identified a number of women who became SOE agents. Amongst them was a woman I'm going to come back to a little bit later on this evening, Yvonne Baisden. So the WAF, a lot of these women were wireless operators already, and they were in the armed forces. So they were a very, very good source for SOE to tap into, quite literally, with those Morse skills, and to bring the agents over and to continue to train them. Now, SOE was also able to gain access to the information provided on the many forms that civilians had to fill out. You think we have it bad today with forms and data protection. You had to have a form for everything: your identity card, your ration card. If you were coming in or going out of the country, they would record literally everything, and you had to pass through this place, the Royal Victoria Patriotic School. And so MI5, as they were, would just keep back information that they thought might be useful to the various resistance organizations that were growing up. They interrogated every foreign national who came through, and they might pass their details on to SOE. So what are you looking for when you're looking for an SOE agent? Well, it was their experience, motives, and personality that were considered the most important. The first qualification for an F-section candidate was they had to be able to pass as a native of the place in which they were going. So for French, France, for example, speak French, look French, blend in with the French countryside, and have a desire to rid France of her Nazi occupiers. Selwyn Jepson said they should have physical courage and sufficient intelligence combined with just enough leadership to enable them to carry out one simple and specific task, usually under orders. Above all, the woman must have a willingness to entertain the possibility of working for SOE, to take on clandestine work, and if needed, to lay down her life for SOE. So why would you do it? The motives absolutely fascinate me, and the reasons for such willingness varied greatly. They were attracted to resistance work for a huge number of reasons: to fight the regime, to protect their families or avenge a loved one's death. Yolanda Beekman, her motive for joining SOE was idealism, the good of the cause, and devotion to duty. Pearl Witherington had served with the office of the British Air Attaché in Paris since 1933 and had escaped to London after the occupation, arriving in July 1941. She said she wanted to find a way to join the fight against the occupiers. And when I interviewed her, she also said, I was really bored working for the Air Attaché and I wanted something with a bit more nous about it. Nancy Wake, well, she'd already been in France. She'd been in the resistance, escaped across the Pyrenees. Her husband was supposed to follow her, but he was caught by the Gestapo and murdered. And she wanted to go back. Phyllis Latour, now, she's the only agent still alive. She's 101, and she lives in New Zealand in a treehouse. I haven't been to visit because I'm not good with heights. She wanted to make her mark against the Germans in revenge for the shooting of her godmother's father, whom she looked on as her own grandfather, and her godmother's subsequent suicide after being imprisoned by the enemy. So those are just a few of the motives of another 35. Now, where did all this happen? Well, F-Section's recruiting officer, Jepson, recognized the agents he recruited had many, many different motives, and he needed to dig down. He needed to get to the bottom of it all during his initial interview. And this was conducted in central London, either at the former Hotel Victoria in Northumberland Avenue or at Horse Guards. If successful, subsequent interviews might be held at Orchard Court, which is just off Baker Street in London. I've just had the honour of using Barnes Wallis bathroom. And I'd like to use the one at Orchard Court too, because it was actually the waiting room. And many of the archives tell us that they had to sit on the toilet of a black marbled bathroom whilst awaiting their interview because there were no chairs. Which is great, isn't it? Now, for some women, it was the first time they'd contemplated war work. For some more experienced hands, it signaled a welcome return to resistance activities. And for some, it broke the monotony of a desk job in the air attaché or WAF. And for several women, it actually meant behind leaving their children in an attempt to secure a safer and brighter future for them. And so Jepson had to get all of this out of them. He had to glean in the interviews exactly what they were capable of and tell them what he wanted them to do. He didn't always give them precise details straight away, but when he did, he told them the dangers of the Gestapo, the chances of survival, which they rated at 50-50. And he then waited for the candidate's reaction. He was very wary of initial bursts of enthusiasm or somebody breaking down in tears, which could indicate a misconceived notion about war work. So as far as I'm aware, about 80 women went through this interview process. And once they were recruited into SOE, they would be given a uniform. So they'd either maintain the uniform of the WAF, if that's what they already had, or they'd been put into the uniform of the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, the FANI, which was vital to the success of SOE, both as a cover story, because you've got to tell your family what you're doing when you go off training, and you've got to explain your absence. And FANI were ambulance drivers, mobile canteen drivers. They did all sorts of duties, so they were a very good cover to explain an absence. And they were also a very good source of personnel. Some 3,000 FANI worked as SOE FANI. They were wireless operators, they were conducting officers, they worked alongside the people training, very, very important. And the wireless operators learnt the way that their counterpart in France used Morse code. It's called the fist, it's like a signature. And they would recognize if something was wrong or if an agent was transmitting under duress. So, in your FANI uniform, with a code name and possibly the beginnings of your cover story, you're put in some sort of transport. Some agents were even blindfolded and sent off to the preliminary training course. Now, there were 5 schools. Things did change as the war went on, but let's stick with this one. This is the early days of training. It was intended to last between 6 to 9 months. So, first of all, they went to Wanborough Manor, or Winterfold Manor in Surrey, here. STS 5, STS 7, STS means Special Training School. I mean, look at them, they're glorious properties. MI6 really couldn't stand SOE. They thought they were a bunch of amateurs. And they said, SOE, well, surely that stands for Stately Homes of England. Which is a little harsh. Now, here at these houses, recruits would take tests to help determine their potential and to highlight their strengths and weaknesses. The course was conducted under commando cover, so local residents and potential agents were told that was what was going on. Brilliant if you're a male agent. If you're female, being in the commandos, come off it. It really did cause some confusion. Odette Weiland actually approached Pearl Witherington and said she thought she'd answered an advert to be a bilingual secretary and was very confused by what was going on. And it's hardly surprising when we turn to Nancy Wake's memoirs. She says there were trees to be climbed, gaps to be jumped, high slack ropes to be crossed with only another slack rope above for a handhold, a dizzying platform off which one must jump and hold on to a rope 6 feet away to slither down to safety. The course was designed to test a recruit's courage, physical strength, and ability to think on their feet, and it clearly wasn't to everybody's taste. Nancy Wake recalled the whole time she'd been fighting the Germans in France, not once had one of them stood at the base of a fireman's ladder with a stopwatch and timed her while she tried to ascend it. Now, what else happened at Wanborough? Well, the lessons were held in French, agents were known by code names and not permitted to talk about their outside lives at all. You've no doubt heard of the honey traps, the women out there to catch the men. I'm not sure if it was done the other way round, but I can tell you this, the drinks cabinet was unlocked and fully stocked. The idea was to encourage agents to drink, to get drunk, and to see how they would react under the influence of alcohol, because it could give them away in an instant. Next, they were sent to the Arisaig and Marat areas of Inverness-shire, which was Special Training School 21 to 26C, 10 shooting lodges. doesn't it look bleak? That was my holiday last year. That's where we went. We tried to walk around that lock and I burst out crying and we had to walk back again. I would never make an agent. So here, physical training, silent killing, weapons training, demolitions training, map reading and compass work, fieldcraft, raid tactics, elementary Morse. Major Angois Fife, the security liaison officer for the training schools in Scotland, said there was no distinction between the sexes and all suffered the same rigours of physical training in the early hours of wintry mornings, the same mud, muck soakings and peat bogs on fieldcraft, and the same sore muscles and aching joints from the Arisaig form of unarmed combat. After all, when they were crawling flat to the ground over the peaty marshes of Loch Marrah, they were all just bods in battle dress. Now, I just skipped over it. What the heck's silent killing, eh? Well, it's this: an aggressive form of unarmed combat, including methods of defense against knife and other attacks, as well as the latest methods. I love that. It means that they changed it as the war went on. The latest methods of attacking and killing sentries and other enemy troops quietly. It was added to the SOE syllabus in June 1942, so just at the time the women were coming into the training. They practiced on straw dummies and they also practiced on one another. Nancy Wake was told that if she hit exactly the right spot, she could still be very effective and effective enough to kill somebody. Something that Pearl Witherington also agreed with when I interviewed her, saying it's not a matter of how hard you hit them, but where you hit them. And I promptly agreed to buy lunch at that point because I thought I'm never going to win. Now, Nancy Wake admitted that learning this silent killing taught you how to kill in a cold-blooded fashion, using only your bare hands or the dagger you see here, the Fairbairn-Sykes dagger. But she said she practiced as hard as she could against the day she might have to use it. And she did. She killed several Germans. Now, Fairbairn and Sykes were the name of the instructors, and they also introduced the Fairbairn-Sykes dagger, which is the one you see being stuck into that poor chap's neck there. They were also taught how to use firearms, as well as plastic explosives and hand grenades. The latter was used on part of the West Highland Line, with permission from the owners, to practice blowing holes in the track. And on another occasion, students inadvertently blew up the bridge at Loch Marrah, and this is how we spent a morning of our holiday trying to find it, and here it is. They stuck Olympic mines to the sides of the wrong boats, much to the fury of local fishermen. And another time, one SOE student wondered what would happen if you threw dynamite into a salmon pool. Yeah, he soon found out. It was quite hard to explain away to the locals. So here are the weapons. At the top we have the Sten gun, perhaps the iconic gun used by resistance, and the diagram and bottom image, the Fairbairn-Sykes fighting knife. And then a variety of spatchets and sleeve daggers on the leather pouch there. Now, attendance on the next course very much depended on being in good physical condition. Parachute training was neither for the faint-hearted nor the physically unsound. This course was held at Ringway Airfield, which is now Manchester International Airport. It was intended all agents should do 4 jumps, 3 from an aircraft and at least 1 from a stationary balloon. And it was essential men and women trained on equal terms. They all had to complete the same course to get their parachute wings and complete training. Yvonne Baisden said she found the parachute training terrifying, but it's always terrifying, you know. You think, oh, I've done it once and it will be fine. Mind you, she said, I had 5 jumps as part of the training, and each one was just as unnatural as the first. She didn't have to jump from the barrage balloon, which she was very grateful for. Nancy Wake did, and was reputedly terrified, screaming as she jumped, "This is awful, I'll be killed, you know, I'll never do it again." She didn't have to do it again. Now, this is great. So, women parachute training during World War II. Not even the Air Transport Auxiliary female pilots got parachute training. No women were jumping from perfectly serviceable aircraft with a bit of silk strapped to their backs. So if the women completed training and got their wings, they had to put them away for the duration of the war. Now, at some time during this training, they were split into 2 groups. You could be a wireless operator or a courier. The wireless training was at Tame Park in Oxfordshire. During the morning, it was a training centre, and in the afternoon, it was operational. And One agent summed it up really quickly, you'll be pleased to hear. Morse, Morse, more Morse. She said, I dreamt in Morse, I knitted in Morse, I got tinnitus, it was in Morse. I listened to birds singing, that was also in Morse. They learned how to fix their wireless sets. They learned how to deal with oscillation and jamming, the change in frequencies, and most importantly, were taught to only be on air for 20 minutes at a time. And after this training, and it could take quite some time to do this training, or it could be really quick, depending on your Morse skills, they were sent to Beaulieu in the New Forest, and they had to learn the elements of clandestine techniques and security. Above all, the importance of looking natural and ordinary whilst doing unnatural and extraordinary things. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Beaulieu. There's a small SOE museum, but also in the grounds of the Abbey, this beautiful memorial, because the agents thought this was the corner of England they were fighting for. It was just so quintessentially English. They had to live and think as if they were already in France, and the reality of what the secret agent meant. They became one with their cover stories, and they were forced out of bed in the middle of the night for the infamous mock interrogation. Without using physical force, the instructors dressed as Gestapo would use sleep deprivation, a light shining in your eyes, being doused in cold water, holding a chair over your head to try and break down the agents. They were taught you needed to hold it together for at least 48 hours to give your colleagues a chance to get away. And that must be absolutely terrifying when you know the techniques that they could be using. So, in a nutshell, that's how you train to be a secret agent. Next, it's a bit like being at school. You get your training reports, and all the instructors would club together and they would report on the various aspects of the training, and they would come up with a sort of concluding paragraph or two to say what they really thought. Yolanda Beekman, a nice girl, darned the men's socks, would make an excellent wife for an unimaginative man, but little more than that. Cracking, isn't it? Her husband was an SOE. So that's what they thought of Yolanda Beekman. Noura Inayat Khan, perhaps one of the most famous agents. She was described as not overburdened with brains, unstable and temperamental personality. Very doubtful whether she's really suited for work in the field. Don't look at the writing, look at the stuff in pencil. We don't want them overburdened with brains. Nonsense. You turn over the page and he says, it makes me cross. This is Maurice Buckmaster, the head of F section, basically overriding everything. This report was expedited up to the head of SOE, Gubbins, and Buckmaster went flying into his office and said, that bastard Spooner has taken against her. This report is absolute balls. He overrode the whole thing and sent Noor into the field, I'm sorry to say, with absolutely dreadful consequences. But they weren't all bad. Lisa Bazak, intelligent, extremely conscientious, reliable, sound in every way, imperturbable, cool and collected, ad infinitum. So they weren't all terrible. And I will say this isn't pure sexism. Some of the men's reports were really nasty as well. One said that a chap was his own worst enemy, and the person who would get him in the most trouble was himself. So they weren't great. Now, you've got two jobs as SOE. I've mentioned the wireless training already. So this is probably the most dangerous job. This is women's jobs. There were male wireless operators as well, but what I'm getting at is women couldn't be circuit leaders. None of them in their reports say that's what they went in for, although some of them became them due to circumstances. Now, the thing about a wireless operator is the Nazis were very good at finding an illegal wireless signal. And to cut a long story short, they have the direction finding vans which could triangulate in on a signal. And if you're in a town, for example, they'll cut off the electricity block by block. When they lose the signal, they found you. Door-to-door searches, all in 20 minutes. And you've got to carry your wireless with you. You can't have it in the same place. You need to move it around the area you're working in. And they're heavy. 30 pounds some of these wireless sets weigh, and you've got to pretend that that's your pajamas and your toothbrush for the weekend. They are incredibly heavy. Some of them have a shelf over the top so you can put your cover story basically on them, so medical supplies, cosmetics, and so on. Now, what I'd like to do is introduce you to the three Yvonnes, all heroines of mine in different ways, just so you know what some of the missions were like. So Yvonne Baisden. Now, I've mentioned her a little bit already. She was in the WAF, and she was chosen to work as a wireless operator in the summer of 1943. She said she found the wireless training difficult and had to learn every technicality of a wireless set, how to repair it if it went wrong, and being part of a wireless operator was a constant coding and decoding. It was all a bit of a nuisance, especially the wireless side of it, because you had to reach a certain speed and receive at a certain speed. I've already mentioned her parachute training. Now, her first attempt at infiltration was aborted. Sorry, I should have said she was 21. Her first attempt at jumping was aborted because the reception committee lights and signals at the landing site were not considered correct by the pilot and the dispatcher. She had to fly all the way back to England and successfully parachuted in on the night of the 17th and 18th of March, 1944. We always use 2 dates because it depends if they went in before or after midnight. Now, she made her way across France to Dole, where she became a wireless operator to the Scholar Network under the circuit leader Hilaire. She became a lifeline back to England and received vital messages. She had 3 of these wireless sets scattered around, 1 in the place where she was staying and 2 at different addresses, so she was constantly on the move. Transmission times were brief, as I've already said. Now, one of the most remarkable things about this lady is what she did in the wake of D-Day. And she was involved in several parachute reception committees. But on the 25th of June, 1944, she was involved in the largest daylight drop of the war. On this day, 32 B-15 flying fortresses flew over the Jura region of France. And amongst those on the ground to receive the goods that they were bringing in was Yvonne. It was amazing, she said, the middle of a Sunday morning, just extraordinary, a lovely sunny day, seeing all of these parachutes dropping and knowing this was all equipment coming in successfully behind D-Day. It was the first and largest operation of its kind during World War II, and she was instrumental in it. It took them 48 hours to receive the goods and then distribute them to various resistance groups and partisans across the region. However, following this drop, her network was compromised, and the Nazis carried out a raid on their depot. It's a complicated story. They shouldn't have been there, but they changed their minds at the last minute, and the young boy who moved her wireless set around for her, thinking that the cheese depot would be empty, sent the Nazis in that direction, and unfortunately, they were all there having lunch. They managed to hide, but a soldier was left behind, and eventually, out of boredom, he started shooting into the ceiling. And when he noticed a pool of blood spread across the ceiling, he knew he had them. That was Lucien, the circuit leader, who took his SOE issue suicide pill. Her arrest was on the 26th of June 1944. She was taken to local Gestapo headquarters for interrogation. She stuck to her cover story, which the Germans didn't believe, and so she was taken to the interrogation room at the basement of the Gestapo headquarters building, where she was left without food and water for 3 days. From Gestapo headquarters, she was sent to Dijon jail for 2 weeks. She was then transferred to Saarbrück concentration camp, and finally to Ravensbrück concentration camp, where she was given the number 62,947. After months of brutal work and desperate privations, Yvonne developed tuberculosis and was put in the Riviere, the camp hospital, which was usually a death sentence. However, something quite extraordinary happened at Ravensbrück in the last days before liberation, and the Swedish Red Cross sent in a convoy to rescue some prisoners. A lady called Mary Lindell, she was MI9, a fellow prisoner and nurse, ensured that Yvonne was on the last van that left Ravensbrück, and she was meant to travel with her, but Fritz Suren, the commandant, called her back at the last minute, so she stayed at Ravensbrück, but Yvonne was free. Now, this convoy was heavily bombed, unfortunately, as it left Ravensbrück, but eventually the patients made their way to Sweden. And when I interviewed Yvonne, she always told me that she woke up under the skeleton of a dinosaur. And I thought, oh, bless her, she was quite delusional, wasn't she? The TB really, took its toll. But actually, they were in the Malmö Natural History Museum. And she really did wake under the skeleton of a diplodocus. She then came back to England and she went to a sanatorium for a year. Unfortunately, she died in 2017, but all of this information is first-hand because I was very lucky to call her my friend. My second Yvonne, if I may be so bold as to keep you, is Yvonne Cormeau. Now, she was a wireless operator for George Starr's wheelwright circuit. She'd been born in Shanghai in 1909, educated in France, Brussels, and then Scotland. She married an accountant, and when war was declared, Charles, her husband, enlisted in the Rifle Brigade, and Yvonne was sent out to the countryside. However, in 1940, he was wounded in France and sent home on sick leave, so they returned to their London flat together. And the flat was hit by a bomb during the Blitz. Yvonne is said to have escaped because the bath fell over her head and protected her, but her husband was killed. Devastated by his death, she decided she wanted to take his place and do something to save France from the Nazis. She joined SOE and parachuted in on the 22nd, 23rd of August, 1943. With this woman's help, the wheelwright circuit became one of the most active and important circuits in France. And for the majority of this time, Yvonne was their only wireless link with London, even training a locally recruited wireless operator. She was held in incredibly high esteem. She was described as perfectly unobtrusive and a secure craftswoman, a first-class operator, a quite remarkable woman. During the next 12 months, she didn't take a single day off, and she sent over 400 messages without a single miscode. And as a result of these flawless messages, Wheelwright received approximately 140 arms drops sent in by the RAF, and she was on the parachute reception committee for a lot of them. She was very security conscious. She didn't mix with other members of her network. She dressed according to local fashions, even down to the gold hooped earrings she thought she needed to wear, so she fitted in. And she chose her safe houses wisely. However, she did stay in the same safe house, one of which had a long garden and a window so she could spot anyone approaching as she worked. Now, neither the house nor the village had any running water or electricity. And while the Nazis knew there was a British wireless operator working in the area, they never went to that house because they thought a British person could not do without their basic amenities. So being English actually saved her. She was in a very, very close shave where she had her wireless set in the car. She was stopped by the Germans, who asked her what was in the suitcase on the back seat of her car, to which she replied, radio. Now, apparently, in Germany, or in German, the word radio can also mean X-ray. Her cover story, you can see the card here, has her registered as a district nurse. And so this German had clearly never seen a wireless set nor an X-ray set in his life, and he told her to get out, which of course she did. She distinguished herself repeatedly by keeping to her scheduled times of transmission with home station as battle raged around her in the wake of D-Day, once so closely that a bullet tore through her skirt, and that skirt is on display in the Imperial War Museum North. She was just a model agent with superb wireless skills and the kind of clarity and coolness that could get her out of many sticky situations. She was exemplary, and many, many people hold her up as being one of the best wireless operators. After the liberation, she participated in something called the Judex mission, where she visited the former F-section and resistance networks in France, meeting those who'd helped agents during the war. So she really was looked up to. Now, my last Yvonne is Yvonne Roudelard. Now, she was 45 years old when she was recruited into SOE, and Jacques de Gillis, who brought her in, thought she had the right qualities. She's often referred to as the grandmother of SOE because she was 45. She didn't have any grandchildren, I'll tell you that. So there we go. Now, she landed by Feluca. She was the first female agent to go into France after this official declaration that women could go. And in March of 1943, she helped to blow up or derail 2 locomotive trains. Cycling out under cover of darkness, she assisted with laying charges, which then detonated to blow a line in the track, making the oncoming train derail, causing mayhem to the rail service and the deaths of those on board. The derailments were very, very important in sort of slowing down the German war effort. That's what it was all about. Now, where would a woman such as Yvonne hide these explosives while transporting them to the railway line? Apparently, it was above the knee band of her knickers, which caused some humour and amusement in SOE headquarters, but she did her job so well that many women followed her. Now, actually, it's the 15th of June today, isn't it? So it's the day that she was arrested 80 years ago today. Along with a man called Pierre Callioli, a man of the Prosper Network, which was the one in the centre of Paris, she had to receive 2 Canadian F-section agents, John McAllister and Frank Pickersgill. 4 days later, after these agents had landed, they picked them up in the car to take them to Beaugency railway station. Now, inside the car, they also had radio equipment that the Canadian agents had brought with them, a package disguised as a Red Cross parcel, but inside which was a pile of messages, all written out to members of the Prosper Circuit using their code names. There were also radio crystals. Everything in the car was illegal and horribly incriminating if it was to be discovered. So they picked up these agents with the aim of taking them to the railway station, where all 4 of them would board a train to Paris and be met by André Borel and Gilbert Norman of the Prosper Circuit, and the 2 Canadians would continue their work. However, they had to go through a village called Douzion, which had been rife with resistance activities recently, so the Germans had laid out roadblocks to stop any traffic coming in and out of the village, and so their car was also stopped. Callioli was ordered to park the car outside the town hall, and all 4 agents were ordered inside to have their identities checked. But it seemed like fortune was smiling on them. Yvonne's and Pierre Callioli's papers passed inspection, and the parcels were all but ignored. They were told they could leave, and returning to the car, they moved off just a few yards and waited with the engine running in the hope that the 2 Canadians wouldn't be far behind them. But something had alerted the German suspicions. Either the prisoner of war parcel, the Canadian accents, whatever it was, a soldier was sent outside and told to bring Callioli and Yvonne back into the building. The engine was running, and to use a modern parlance, Callioli floored it. He hit the accelerator as fast as he could, and the couple sped away, pursued by 3 German cars. Stopping for nothing, they drove straight through a barricade which shattered the windscreen. Shots were fired at their car, and while Yvonne was keeping an eye on the danger behind them, she was shot in the head with a bullet. Assuming that she was dead and knowing he didn't have his suicide pill with him, Callioli either lost control on a bend or, as he later stated, deliberately tried to kill himself by crashing into the wall of a house. Still alive, he jumped out of the wreckage and tried to make a run for it, but he was shot in the leg and hit the ground. Yvonne was also still alive. They were both taken back to the town hall, where the parcel had been opened, revealing 2 small wireless sets, crystals and messages. Equally incriminating was a large sum of money in the belt around McAllister's waist. Yvonne and Callioli were taken away to the hospital, where they were treated for their injuries. And then they were sent to various prisons and camps. Now, Yvonne was first of all sent to Fort de Romainville, and it was noted she was a Nacht und Nebel prisoner, night and fog. This was Hitler's edict to get rid of resistance members. You would simply disappear into the night and fog. She was then sent to Ravensbrück, where Yvonne Basden was held. And as a Nacht und Nebel, she couldn't receive or send letters. Nobody knew who she was, and it is believed that she suffered memory loss as a result of this head injury. Now, she survived Ravensbrück until the end of February 1945, when she and approximately 2,500 other women, most of whom were elderly, ill or infirm, were told they were being taken away to a convalescent camp. But it wasn't. It was the notorious Bergen-Belsen. She arrived on the 2nd of March 1945, still suffering from exhaustion and weakness, and she struggled to survive. She maintained that her cover story was Jacqueline Gautier, and she did not disclose to anyone that she was British or SOE. It's questionable if she even could remember that. The camp was liberated on the 15th of April 1945 by British soldiers, but even after the liberation, the death rate was astronomical, with some 20,000 inmates dying in the first few weeks. And very sadly, amongst them was Yvonne Roudelaar. The last time her name appeared on any list was the 19th of April. She's believed to have died of malnutrition and ill health, and her fragile remains were buried in an unmarked grave alongside the nameless thousands who were murdered at Bergen-Belsen. So in my research and my work, I've tried to ensure that the stories of all 39 women who went into France with F section have their stories told and that they get the recognition they deserve. I would hazard that you might not have heard of some of the women that I've mentioned tonight. And I really want to chart the work of all of them, investigate their roles, contributions, foibles, successes, and failures. It's very clear that women didn't work alone. They had a network behind them. I've mentioned many male agents as we've gone along, and they were just as important, and their work was just as dangerous. Now, the female agents worked incredibly efficiently given the dangers they faced, not only the obvious ones in wartime, such as rationing or the fear of the Gestapo or collaborators, but also the threats of exhaustion, illness, and for one of them, even childbirth. The sacrifice and bravery of those who were captured, facing imprisonment, interrogation, or the concentration camps is exemplary, and it's inspiring. There were 3 women who survived the camps, and they suffered greatly both mentally and physically, both during and after their incarcerations. 12 of them died or were murdered in the camps. And those who came back, well, they'd undertaken immensely dangerous missions in enemy-occupied territory. Between them, they had cycled thousands of kilometers, sent hundreds of wireless messages, faced identity checks, dealt with the daily fear of the Gestapo, and endured privations that I would hazard it is impossible for you and I to understand. They worked tirelessly and risked everything for the cause in which they wholeheartedly believed. The contribution of these women to the work of SOE F Section played a pivotal role in the liberation of France from Nazi occupation, and in bringing an end to the Second World War by helping to secure an Allied victory. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Sorry for overrunning.
Thank you, Kate, for a most illuminating talk. Even having read the book, to hear your descriptions over again, it's just mind-blowing. And I guess the thought is, what would we have done? But the way that those ladies they went forward, even if they failed the testing procedures and didn't get as far as the line, at least they stood up to be counted. And that's important as well. So thank you very much.
You're welcome,
indeed.
thank you.
And now, as usual, we have a roving mic. I am very happy to be offering the mic around. Kate has kindly agreed to take questions. So is there anybody who has a question like to start?
Hello, Kate. You very kindly introduced us as mother ladies, some of which I did know, names of. But what I don't know is how many of them were actually publicly thanked after the Second World War, regardless whether they came home or didn't come home. Mm-hmm. We know about those who received the George medals, like Odette and Violette's husband. But what about the other ladies? Did they actually get any form of recognition at all?
So you're right, some of them are very, very famous. The reasons for that fame are, as you say, the George Cross. So as soon as a George Cross is awarded, it's gazetted. So, people always say, oh, they signed the Official Secrets Act. Well, it doesn't really hold water once you've been gazetted and your story's blattered all over the papers. And also the war crimes trials brought some of these women or catapulted their names into the public domain. They were recognised in various ways. So you've got 3 George Crosses. They weren't eligible for the Victoria Cross. because you have to be fighting in uniform and do a certain action that gets you cited, although they did try to change it. So some of them got MBEs, some got mentions in dispatches, some were recognised by the French, so they've got the Légion d'honneur, the Croix de Guerre. I think the argument is that some of them didn't receive the recognition they should have done. At the moment, I'm campaigning along with Lady Olga Maitland for an agent called Diana Rowden, who was murdered brutally at Natzweiler. And she didn't get her, I think it's an MBE, and the reason being it has to be given, it can't be given posthumously. And the citation was dated after she died. Now, if they'd, like Yvonne Rudolph, if they'd cited it before the date of death, she could have got it. So there's some real discrepancies. But my favourite story about decorations is Pearl Witherington, who was given the civil MBE after the war. And she returned it with a rather curt note saying, "Thank you, but I did nothing civil." So eventually they gave her the military MBE. So yeah, there are decorations. It's a bit of a minefield.
Hello, Kate. Firstly, thanks for the extraordinary talk. That's amazing. I was just at Brookwood Cemetery this afternoon, just before coming to the event. Are any of your the names of your agents memorialised at the Ring of the Missing at Brookwood Cemetery? Do you know? Or...
At Brookwood?
Yeah.
Yes, there are.
Amazing.
Yeah, all of the missing agents who were in the first aid nursing yeomanry, because you've obviously got the RAF memorial, and the name of that escapes me completely. What's it called? Runnymede. Yeah, so the WAF women are on Runnymede, and anyone who wasn't WAF is on the Brookwood Memorial. Yeah. So they're all there. They're all named in some way, because they're memorials to the missing as well. So, because of course these women were killed in the concentration camps, so there's no knowledge of where their bodies are. How many women went to France? So for F section, there's 39. And RF section, which was de Gaulle's, had 11, so it's 50 women in total. I might be looking at de Gaulle's section for another project, which might be called Mission Europe, which might come out in spring 2025. So you have to buy this one first, though, because it's a sequel. So yeah, there were 50 in total. And of those, just to say who didn't come home, 12 were executed. And this is within F section, and one of them died of meningitis, actually, out in the field. So it's a very small number. They seem to be very, very famous, but it's a small number in comparison with the number of men. So F section sent out 480 men, but their names, I would argue, aren't quite as well known as the women's are, for obvious reasons, really.
Hello, thank you, Kate. That was absolutely amazing presentation. I went to one recently, a couple of months back, at a club in London, and that was based mainly about Violette Szabo. And I wonder if there was any interaction between these ladies and Violette Szabo.
Szabo was one of these women.
She was one of those.
Yeah, she's one of the 39, yes.
So she's in your book. Well,
she is. She's in my book, yes.
Thank you.
Szabo went on 2 missions. The first one was to Rouen, I believe, for a few days. And then she went in just after D-Day, literally the day after D-Day, because I always think how amazing to fly out over that flotilla. But unfortunately, she was arrested on the 10th of June. So, yeah, she's one of these women, and she's in the book.
Thank you very much for a fantastic talk. Two questions. One, were there any women operatives in N section from Norway?
There were locally recruited women in Norway.
Yeah, but nothing from sort of, yeah.
But no, so the way that I look at, or the way I call them SOE agents, is they had to have done their training in the UK, or an SOE base in Algiers called Massingham. Yeah. Or actually there's one in Palestine as well, which I'm now counting as well. Okay. But they had to do formal SOE training. So I'm not aware of any women in Norway, but I haven't looked into it in great detail.
Okay. In fact, I've got 3 questions. Where does your passion come from for the subject? It's a deep passion, but where did it start?
It is a big passion. So let's go right back to the beginning. I don't know if anyone remembers a TV programme in the 80s called Wish Me Luck. It was on Sunday tea time on ITV with Jane Asher and Kate Buffery. And I just remember being hooked on this program. It's the same women who wrote Tenko. I'm not going to lie and say I then, had a passion for SOE right from being 8 years old, but I went to work at a museum, the Royal Armouries Museum, as a performer, and I started to look at women's role in warfare, and I remembered, I thought, oh, if only Wish Me Luck was real. It was. So that's sort of where it all started. And if you told 8-year-old me that I'd be Facebook friends with Kate Buffery, I wouldn't have believed you. But there we are. I got to interview her for my PhD. So I summed it up. It's somebody else's quote, but ordinary people doing extraordinary things. I just find it remarkable.
And one last question. I had the privilege to meet Violet Szabó's mother, Tanya, who used to live, I come from Jersey, and Tanya taught English in Jersey. And I went to the auction of Violet's medals in London years ago. And I've written a book about the agents, and she said to me, have you got a title? And I said, not yet. And she said, have you got a code poem? And she said that was one of the most important things that the agents had to have was a code poem for transmission. So I wrote a code poem, sent it to her, and from that came the title of my book. And she said, it's most important that the code poems. Do you have any other code poems in your books that they used, and have you explored that at all?
Well, Violet's code poem is supposed to be this one written by Leo Marx.
Yes, Leo Marx.
Which is a life that I have. I'm no expert on coding. I've studied this 20 years. I started when I was 5. I've been studying it forever, and I still don't understand coding. So I would recommend you read Leo Marx's book, Between Silk and Cyanide, and who takes you right through all the codes.
I have, but also I just wondered if you'd come across any of the wording of the poetry of the code poems, because some of them were almost love stories, love poems.
There are bits and pieces in the files. They show you some of what they call the fair play codes as well. So if you go into the files, sometimes you'll find them in there. Some of the other poems, but some of them are just well-known poems. It was only when Marx realised that the Germans would recognise, I can't think of a famous poet right now, but that they'd recognise the poetry that he started to write original stuff for them.
Lovely.
So yeah, there's some stuff in the files, especially when you come to the Netherlands section.
Yeah. Thank you very much for fabulous.
You're welcome.
Talk.
Once again, thank you. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
You didn't touch at all on Vera Atkins, was it? Who was a female who trained, and I just wondered whether you were do another book on her.
Well, she's an agent, and my book's purely about the agents. That said, she is in the book. So Vera Atkins was Maurice Buckmaster's second in command in F section. So a lot of people would say she was in charge, really. So she worked in the office. She had a very important role. She kept abreast of where agents were and what they were doing. She would deal with all the reports coming in. She went with them when they were flown out, so she'd usually go to the airfield with them. She famously gave Noor Inayat Khan her brooch of a lapwing that she then wore right the way through her incarceration. So Vera comes into her own in terms of this story after the war. So by the time war was over, the SOE files for F section had 118 agents missing. So they had to try and find out what had happened to them. Now, I mentioned this Nacht und Nebel, night and fog, so there weren't really very decent records kept of where they were. And Atkins made it her job to go and find them. But SOE lasted as long as Winston Churchill did. It basically came into being as he came into office and closed down as he left office. It was very, very short-lived. So Atkins had to go and join the Judge Advocate's office, and she went out to Germany to try and find these 118 missing agents. So she went to the various camps where she was led to believe they were from survivors coming back from the camps who could tell her stories. And she pieced it all together. If you do happen to read my book, the last 3 chapters really talk about what Atkins discovered when these women were taken to various camps and executed. And she did the same with the men. So out of 118 missing, she found 117. And the one missing one, she thinks, parachuted with a big money belt and went to the south of France to the casinos and never came back. which is unsurprising, isn't it? But no, she did a brilliant job. And it haunted her for the rest of her life, I think. The things she heard, the things she had to put together. I mean, the one that haunts me the most is probably the Natzweiler executions. And she had to deal with all of that and interview these people. She interviewed Rudolf Höss as well, the commandant of Auschwitz. Not that any of the agents went there, but she was so good at interviewing. She interviewed Höss as well. So, yeah, she's an incredible lady, for sure. No, she didn't, no. No, she was Romanian. Sarah Helm's book's worth a read, A Life in Secrets.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'd just like to ask a question. How do women feature in Cold Wars as opposed to hot wars? And was there an iteration of the SOE during the Cold War at all?
That's such a good question. I mean, women continue to work in spying. Now, SOE, I would argue, weren't spies, they were agents. So they weren't sending back intelligence reports as such. It wasn't their main duty. Their main duty was blow things up. So that really comes into SIS MI6's remit, because SOE disappears. We know for a fact that in the States with the Office of Strategic Services became the CIA, and Virginia Hall, who I mentioned right at the beginning, was a very important part of the CIA, and they use female agents going forwards. There's some brilliant stuff about all the equipment and the disguise section. The chief of disguise does loads of stuff on YouTube for the Spy Museum. So we know that in the States they did. The issue we have in the United Kingdom is that the SIS files, even from wartime, are still under lock and key. So my answer is, it seems obvious, doesn't it, that women would continue through the Cold War and to do that kind of work, but we'll never see those files. So I assume so. It'd be daft not to, wouldn't it? They clearly did a pretty good job. That's a great question. I'm going to go and do some more research now. That's another book.
So, Kate, that sends you off onto your next project.
It does, thank you.
But before you go, may we thank you again for the most wonderful, fascinating evening.